I am Inspector, and I solve mystery. Welcome to my new case.
I've often thought that Oxford looks most itself in the rain. The wet pavement shine like polished stone, the lamps bleed faintly into the mist, and the bells, always late by a breath, spread their melancholy across the quadrangles. That night I could not sleep, and like so many other nights, I let the city walk me. I drifted down Beaumont Street after leaving the Randolph, the faint taste of whiskey still clinging to the back of my throat. Some men pray before bed. I read and wander. The streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional scholar hurrying with collar turned up, or a couple whispering under a single umbrella. I envied the second and mistrusted the first. I passed the Ashmolean, its windows dark, and turned toward Broad Street where the cobblestones glistened. Somewhere behind me, a bicycle rattled over a drain and disappeared into silence. In my coat pocket, the folded newspaper reminded me of its presence. I'd taken it with me from the bar, more from habit than interest. And in Radcliffe Square, under the jaundiced light of a solitary lamp, I opened it. I expected little. The usual petty crimes, academic squabbles inflated into public debate, letters from retired colonels misunderstanding the modern world. And there they were. But halfway down a column, tucked without ceremony beneath an item about a minor accident on the Banbury Road, my eye stopped. Fellow of St. Athanasius College found dead in his rooms. Natural causes suspected. The line was brief, almost dismissive, as if the death of a fellow were no more remarkable than a traffic diversion. Dr. Edmund Fawley, aged 63. A modest note about his research in Italian Renaissance portraiture. Arrangements to be announced. That was all. Yet I stood there, newspaper softening in the rain, and read it again, and then once more. I'd met Fawley. Not well, not enough to number him among acquaintances, but well enough to place the tone of his voice, the cautious politeness in his eye. A man who measured words before releasing them. He had given a lecture on Giotto some years ago, and I remembered less of his argument than of the way he lingered on a slide too long, as if reluctant to let his audience depart from the painter's gaze. A man faintly out of place in his own time, more earnest than cynical, which is always dangerous in Oxford. Natural causes suspected. I could not escape the phrasing. Suspected by whom? Death is usually either natural or not. Suspicion, once introduced, makes its own weather. I folded the paper again, though the words would not stay folded. Around me, the square exhaled its damp breath. The Radcliffe camera loomed above like some vast sentinel. I felt the old irritation rising, the sense that something important had been placed before me, deliberately obscured, like a crossword clue whose answer sits on the tip of the tongue. A bell tolled somewhere from the north. I thought of the Dons, still awake, scratching notes for tomorrow's lecture, or warming hands on whiskey beside an electric fire. The city sleeps unevenly. I walked on toward Magdalen Bridge, my shoes protesting at each puddle. An undergraduate couple kissed by the gate. I pretended not to see them. In the High, the shops stood shuttered, the rain running in dark rivulets over their signs. I bought another paper from a kiosk about to close, though I already knew the report would be the same. And indeed it was, almost word for word. That troubled me more. Someone had chosen the phrasing carefully and chosen to repeat it. Lewis would not thank me for raising suspicions where none officially existed. He was still learning to trust the ghost of intuition. Strange, of course, would grumble that I read too much into everything. Perhaps I did. But the words clung. I paused outside a chapel where a light burned low behind stained glass. The glass looked blurred, as if the saints themselves were dissolving in the rain. Sleep would not come easily now. I thought of Fawley, alone in his rooms, his papers scattered, his books unopened for the last time. The city had already forgotten him, reduced him to a line beneath a traffic accident. By the time I turned back toward my flat, the paper had begun to tear at the folds. I carried it carefully, as if it were a fragile letter. I told myself, not for the last time, that I was merely curious. Yet I already knew that curiosity, once seeded, never let me go. The stillness of Oxford that night was deceptive. It was the stillness before something stirred. Lewis drove, as he usually did, and the morning rain softened the windscreen into a blur of grey ribbons. He hummed tunelessly to the radio until I reached forward and turned it off. He took the hint with his usual good humour. Conversation was never his burden, nor silence his enemy. St. Athanasius revealed itself with less grandeur than many of its neighbours, a modest college tucked discreetly behind high stone walls. The gatehouse seemed too large for the court it guarded, and the porter eyed us as though we had arrived to inspect contraband. Lewis gave his name, mine, and the purpose of our visit. Death still opens doors more efficiently than rank. The master awaited us in his rooms, lined with books not so much read as displayed, their spines stiff, their gilt letters untarnished. He spoke with the cultivated assurance of one accustomed to presiding over dinners and benefactors' meetings. Dr. Fawley, he explained, had succumbed quietly to his heart. Nothing untoward. A doctor had been summoned, a certificate signed. He said untoward as if rehearsed. I asked whether Fawley had complained of pain. The master smiled thinly, as though the question itself were vulgar. Hearts fail, Chief Inspector, especially when over 60. Lewis, less inclined to subtlety, pressed him on Fawley's personal life. Was there family? Friends? The master's answers grew shorter. No immediate relatives, no close confidants. Life lived for scholarship, yet in the stairwell, where sound carries too easily, I caught whispers from 2 junior fellows descending ahead of us. The words failed promotions, bitter rivalries drifted down like ash. When they turned and saw me listening, the younger of the 2 blushed and hurried his companion out into the quad. Lewis noticed my expression. You don't think it was natural, sir. I told him only that nature is rarely so tidy. The senior common room smelled of old wood and sherry. Portraits of past masters glared from the walls with that mixture of disdain and fatigue peculiar to academic likenesses. On the far side hung a larger canvas, an oil of some anonymous scholar in his chair. Something about it arrested me. The hands seemed newer than the face, the brush strokes bolder, fresher, as if retouched long after the original had dried. I said nothing. At luncheon we joined several fellows around a long, polished table. Silver clattered with studied gentility. Conversation slid toward the weather, the scarcity of grants, the government's latest interference. Fawley's name surfaced only briefly, like a fish breaking water before vanishing again. It was Professor Markham, a man whose spectacles seemed too heavy for his nose, who offered the only tribute. A pity about Edmund, he said. He was, after all, a most patient reader of Dawn. He attempted to recite, "Death be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so." And then he faltered, replacing terrible where the poet had written dreadful. The substitution was small, almost forgivable. Yet it clanged in my ear. Scholars do not misquote by accident. They reveal themselves by choice of error. Lewis ate dutifully beside me, his knife sawing quietly at the meat. He would later confess he had noticed little beyond the quality of the pudding. But my mind was already circling around the misstep, as one circles a crossword clue with too many possible answers. When we took our leave, the master accompanied us only as far as the door, his courtesy measured, his relief evident. Out in the quad, the grass wet and shining, I felt the peculiar air of concealment that colleges exhale when watched. St. Athanasius was not a stage for grandeur, but for secrets rehearsed in smaller rooms. Lewis asked what I had made of it all. That it was not the heart which failed first, I said. It was something far older, something inside these walls. He frowned at the riddle, accustomed by now to my evasions, and started the car. As we drove away, I found myself thinking less of the fellow's evasions than of that altered painting. Paintings, like people, change when they are touched too often. I had learned long ago that the quickest way into a college is not through the master, but through the women who inhabit its quieter corridors. Eleanor Chase taught English at St. Athanasius, though taught is too blunt a word. She seemed less to instruct than to haunt her, students into thought, her presence measured, her remarks half withheld. She agreed to meet me in the cloisters late in the afternoon, when the rain had thinned into mist and the stones bled their dampness upwards into the air. She was tall, more angular than graceful, though the effect was not without its appeal. A dark coat, a scarf that looked too heavy for September, hair drawn back severely. She regarded me with a kind of wary courtesy, the look one gives a man who has read too many books, but not the right ones. "You knew Doctor?" "Forley?" I asked. Her eyes did not drop. "Yes." "Well enough." She left the rest unsaid, and I let the silence breathe. People reveal more when silence is allowed to grow a little uncomfortable. "He was kind," she said at last, "and foolish sometimes. He could never quite reconcile scholarship with the ordinary world, a weakness if one is honest. I suggested that many scholars shared that weakness. Not in quite the same way," she replied, turning her gaze to the cloister arches. "Some bury themselves in footnotes, others in people. Edmund, he always wanted the one to become the other. It was carefully phrased, neither affectionate nor hostile, as though she had rehearsed an answer that admitted nothing and concealed everything. I pressed her gently, whether she had seen him recently, whether he had seemed troubled. She nodded to each question, but offered no color, no detail, only that same careful minimalism. "We all dream our lives differently each time we sleep," she said then, almost to herself. He often spoke of that, of the ways memory shifts each night, and how we are never quite the same person in the morning. I wrote the words down later in my notebook, though at the time I only nodded, pretending to find them commonplace. Yet they lodged in me with the obstinacy of a half-solved clue. When we parted, she gave no gesture of warmth, no hand extended, no softening of the eyes, only the same austere poise, as if she had walked straight from a lecture into this conversation and would return to her books the moment I left. Lewis found me later in the porter's lodge, where the smell of damp coats lingered. He had been speaking with one of the clerks, who, unlike the fellows, enjoyed the currency of gossip. Eleanor Chase, he told me with satisfaction, had once been a candidate for the very fellowship that Forley obtained. Some years ago. The vote had been close, but the college chose him. She apparently never forgave them. A possible grudge then, Lewis concluded, with the solid confidence of a man who preferred motives neat and unambiguous. I did not contradict him. Yet the thought of her harboring bitterness seemed oddly ill-fitting, like a shoe one knows is the wrong size. Ambition, yes. Reserve, certainly. But spite? I doubted it. Women like Eleanor Chase do not cling to old wounds. They transmute them into something sharper, quieter, more difficult to trace. We walked once more through the cloisters before leaving. The dusk had deepened, and our footsteps sounded too loud against the flagstones. I thought of her words, the dreams reshaping us each night, and wondered what kind of man she had dreamt Edmund Forley to be, and whether that dream had soured into regret. Lewis, sensing my preoccupation, asked what I had thought of her. I told him she seemed intelligent, that she chose her words carefully, that she knew more than she wished to confess. He muttered that most of them did, and he was right. But as we stepped back into the street, the drizzle resuming its patient descent upon Oxford, I carried her phrase with me like a tune I could not discard. We all dream our lives differently each time we sleep. A poet's line, perhaps, though not one I could place. Misquotation, invention, or memory's own embroidery. I underlined it later in the quiet of my rooms and left the notebook open beside the half-empty glass of whiskey. Some phrases wait years before their meaning arrives. It was Lewis who first unearthed the detail, though by accident more than intent. He had been sifting through receipts in Fawley's desk, a task I considered thankless, when he discovered an envelope from a small inn some miles outside the city. "A modest place," he said, "not one of your grand hotels. Rooms barely large enough for a bed and a desk." I'd been to the inn before, years earlier, when a different case demanded a different explanation. The sign still swung on its rusty bracket, its painted letters fading, as though eroded not by weather, but by indifference. We arrived in the late afternoon, when the smell of roasting meat leaked from the kitchen, and the landlord, a heavy man with graying hair, wiped his hands on his apron as if in perpetual apology. Yes, he remembered Doctor Fawley. A quiet gentleman, never made trouble, always settled his bill, stayed irregularly, once every month or two, always the same room, number 4, overlooking the car park. He preferred it, said the landlord. Something about the view. I could not imagine what view, a scatter of tired vehicles, a hedge broken in places, and beyond that a field that seemed permanently damp. Did he come alone? Lewis asked. The landlord hesitated, then shrugged. Not always. Once or twice with a younger fellow. A student, perhaps. I never asked, not my business. They ate together sometimes, sometimes not. Paid separately, as I recall. The words fell without emphasis, yet in their ordinariness lay a faint pulse of secrecy. Why here? Why this place, if not for privacy? The register lay on the counter, a thick book whose pages bore the stains of years. The landlord slid it forward obligingly. You'll find him easy enough. Always wrote in a careful hand. Not like some of the scrawls I get. I opened to the middle and found the first entry at once. Edmund Fawley, Oxford. The letters neat, deliberate, with an academic's preference for clarity. A date beside it and a signature on the next line that might have been his, though smaller, hastier. I turned the pages slowly, letting the rhythm of repetition show itself. His name returned month after month, sometimes in that clear hand, sometimes with letters slanted forward as though written in haste at the door. Always the same name, always the same room. But it was not the consistency that troubled me. It was the inconsistency beneath it. The E in Edmund sometimes curved gracefully, sometimes jagged, truncated. The W in Fawley either closed tight or sprawled loosely across the margin. No man writes identically every time, but the difference here suggested two habits, two hands, as though the same name had been borrowed, imitated, or shared. Lewis peered over my shoulder. Looks like he was in a hurry sometimes, sir. Perhaps. But the more I looked, the more the hurried signatures seemed not hurried at all, but alien. Not careless, but different. I took out my pencil and circled them, one after another, until a constellation formed across the pages. The landlord shifted uneasily, as though the marks themselves accused him. "Did you ever notice this?" I asked. He shook his head. "Can't say I did. We get all sorts here. I don't study the letters." "No," I thought. "You do not. That is my particular vice." Room 4 was unoccupied, and with a key we climbed the narrow stairs. The room bore no trace of its former guest. No scent, no forgotten book, no indentation in the carpet. Only the bland furnishings of 100 brief stays. The wallpaper peeling at the edges, the window rattling faintly in the wind. Yet I stood by the bed longer than necessary, as if the air itself retained something unspoken. Lewis busied himself at the desk, pulling open drawers that yielded nothing. He asked what I thought it meant. The two hands. It means, I said, that names are more hospitable than rooms. Anyone may inhabit them. He frowned, muttered about riddles, and let the matter rest. But I carried the register with me in my mind long after we left, each circled name like a candle guttering in the dark. One hand careful, the other careless. One perhaps genuine, the other counterfeit. Which was which, I could not yet tell. As we drove back toward Oxford, the fields blurred by dusk, I caught myself repeating the letters silently, as though the shapes themselves might whisper their secret. Edmund Forley. The same, and not the same. It was Lewis who carried the photograph into the light, holding it gingerly as though it might crumble with the air. He had been burrowing in the college archives with the quiet patience of a terrier, and when he placed it on the desk between us, he said only that it might be of interest. A group portrait, St. Athanasius. Early 1970s by the look of the suits, the hairlines, the brownish tone of the print. Dons and lecturers arranged in the stiff rows of formality, some standing, some seated, all of them exuding that mixture of pride and discomfort peculiar to academics asked to sit, still together, and there, on the far right, unmistakably, Edmund Forley. Younger, of course, the hair still dark, the features less worn. He sat a little apart, as though unable quite to join the fraternity. Lewis leaned closer, tapping with a finger that left a faint smudge. "Look," he said, "someone's been at it." And so they had. Several of the faces bore the lightest of circles, almost invisible until one tilted the page. Pencil, applied sparingly, just enough to leave a halo around certain heads. Among them, Eleanor Chase, her face sharper than it is now, gaze already distant. And beside her, Professor Markham, spectacles even then riding heavily upon his nose. "Who circled them?" Lewis asked. "That," I replied, "is the question." The circles were too faint, too secretive to be casual doodling. They suggested someone revisiting the past with a particular purpose, marking significance in silence. A catalogue of the remembered, or the accused. But it was not the circles that troubled me most. It was the picture itself. I stared at it longer than I care to admit, letting my eyes drift over the ranks of faces, the folds of gowns, the awkward postures. Something in it jarred, faintly but persistently, like a wrong note held in a chord. "What's the matter?" Lewis asked. I told him I didn't know, and that was the truth. Yet some part of the composition resisted harmony, as though an absence had been stitched into the image. It is not always the presence of a thing that betrays the lie. Sometimes it is the silence left behind. We carried the photograph to the window where the light caught it more clearly. I traced with my finger along the back row, across the seated figures, down to Forley himself. He had positioned his hands upon his lap, not touching, not relaxed, as though the camera might misinterpret them. His expression was neutral, yet his eyes seemed directed not at the lens, but at something, or someone, just beyond its frame. I asked Lewis what he saw. "Just a bunch of dons looking miserable," he said, "like they'd rather be anywhere else." It was a fair assessment, but I could not abandon the feeling that the misery was deliberate, cultivated, as though the photograph had preserved not faces, but a mood. Lewis was less concerned with moods. He pointed again at Eleanor Chase's circle. "You think she did this herself, or someone else keeping tabs on her?" "Perhaps both," I murmured. "Circles are as much for the writer as for the reader." He frowned, said he didn't follow. I told him it was not necessary to. We left the archives with the copy in hand, the porter grumbling at the paperwork. Back in my rooms, I laid it flat upon the table and studied it over whiskey. The more I stared, the more convinced I became that the wrongness lay not in what the camera captured, but in what had been removed. A shadow of absence lingered, impossible to name. The faces swam before me. Chase aloof, Markham awkward, Forley withdrawn. a trinity of silence. And around them the faint graphite halos, circling lives as if to summon them for some private reckoning. Lewis returned later with sandwiches and found me still gazing. He laughed, asked if I expected the faces to move. Perhaps I did. Photographs, after all, are not fixed. They alter with each viewing, reflecting not the moment they were taken, but the eyes that return to them. Something was wrong with that picture. I knew it, though the knowledge refused to translate into words. Like a crossword clue whose surface reading misdirects, the answer lay waiting beneath, mocking me with its clarity withheld. I've never been fond of neat solutions. They arrive too quickly, like gifts wrapped in bright paper, and one learns that bright paper conceals only disappointment. Yet now and then, the clues gather of their own accord, aligning with such suspicious tidiness that even I am tempted. The register with its twin handwritings, the faint circles on the photograph, the rivalry over the fellowship. The strands began to braid themselves into a single thread. Edmund Fawley, respectable fellow of St. Athanasius, had nurtured a relationship with a younger man, perhaps a student. A risk in itself, but one compounded by the conservatism of the college, the whispers of impropriety, the potential ruin of reputation. Someone must have known, and who better than Eleanor Chase, passed over for the post he obtained, left to linger on the margins while he enjoyed the fruits of her disappointment. Ambition curdles quickly in Oxford. It needs only the souring agent of injustice. I pictured Eleanor, sharp and solitary, seizing upon Fawley's secret as leverage, the way an embittered don might reach for a phrase of Donne and alter it deliberately. Blackmail need not be for money. In Oxford, it is reputation that is extorted, the currency of silence purchased by the threat of disclosure. I constructed the narrative almost without effort. Fawley, pressured, fearful, driven to those clandestine visits at the inn. Eleanor, holding the knowledge like a dagger, letting it press just enough against the skin. A confrontation, a refusal, a sudden collapse. The heart gives way when fear is sharpened into terror. It was plausible. Plausibility is often the most dangerous quality of all. Lewis, hearing it laid out in the dim comfort of my rooms, brightened visibly. At last, something tangible. He relished the simplicity of motive, jealousy, resentment, retribution. "We should bring her in," he said, and his voice carried the eagerness of a man who wants a case concluded, signed off, filed away. But eagerness is not evidence. I told him we would speak to her again. Nothing more. Eleanor received us in her college office, a room that smelled faintly of old leather and cold radiators. Books lined the walls, annotated, inhabited. She sat at her desk, a pen still in her hand, as if we had interrupted a thought. I asked her where she had been during the week of Fawley's last visit to the inn. Her eyes did not waver. "Abroad," she said. "A conference in Florence. The diary is there if you require it." She turned to the shelf, withdrew a slim notebook bound in red, and handed it to me without hesitation. The dates were precise, the entries neat, the tickets and receipts folded into the back. Florence. Lectures delivered, galleries visited, dinners attended. An itinerary so ordinary it carried the weight of truth. Lewis frowned, unconvinced. "Easy enough to forge such a thing," he muttered later. But I knew better. A forged alibi tends to overperform. This one was as pedestrian as rain. And besides, the faint smile on her face told me she knew we would come, and that she had nothing to fear. I handed back the diary, thanked her, and she inclined her head slightly, as if acknowledging a compliment never spoken. The conversation drifted to other matters. The pressures on younger academics, the shrinking of grants, the fading appetite of students for poetry. She spoke with an aloofness that was neither arrogance nor indifference, but something colder, a refusal to be drawn. As we left, Lewis whispered that she was hiding something. "Everyone is," I said, "but not what we thought." Back in the car, he stared glumly through the windscreen, disappointed that the neat picture had dissolved. He wanted certainties, a culprit pinned. I, strangely, felt something closer to relief. For all my suspicion, I had not wished Eleanor to be guilty. Guilt sat uneasily upon her, like an ill-fitting garment. That night, with whiskey softening the edges of thought, I considered the collapsed theory. Blackmail was plausible? Yes. But neatness has never been the hallmark of truth. The answer still lingered elsewhere, in the blurred lines of the register, in the photograph that looked wrong because something was missing, in the words she had spoken about dreams altering us each night. The first solution had proved itself a mirage. Yet mirages have their uses. They tell you what thirst you are carrying. It arrived without ceremony, the way truth often does. A thin envelope slipped beneath my door in the late afternoon, unstamped, unsigned. Inside, a single sheet of paper, its surface worn by the pressure of a fountain pen, the words set down with a deliberation that suggested both care and urgency. 4 lines only, arranged as a quatrain. At first glance I thought of Hardy, that master of bleak cadences, whose verses I had read often enough to know their habitual music. Yet something was awry. The cadence faltered, the rhyme clumsy where Hardy would never stumble. It was as if a melody I half knew had been played on an untuned piano. I read it aloud, slowly, letting the words settle in the corners of the room. Lewis, had he been present, would have shrugged, dismissing it as undergraduate mischief. But mischief does not select Hardy as its disguise. Mischief prefers limericks and scrawled obscenities. This was something else. The words clung to me through the evening. I poured whiskey, more than I should have, and set an old Verdi record spinning on the turntable, the voice of the tenor climbing the rafters while the poem lay before me like a crossword clue whose setter had chosen to conceal the definition under dust. I tried Hardy first, of course. The volume from my shelf, its spine cracked, fell open easily to poems I'd read too often. But the lines refused to match. A word here replaced, a rhyme twisted, a meter shortened. Substitution, not quotation. Someone had placed their finger firmly on the text and shifted it just enough to create unease. By midnight, the whiskey had worked its slow anesthesia, and the record had finished its cycle, the stylus resting in silence. I stared again at the quatrain, tracing its peculiar deviations. One word in particular, altered, yet not arbitrarily. Where Hardy would have written June, here it was January. A colder month, a different resonance, and then another change. A name instead of a pronoun, as if the poem were suddenly populated. January. A name, a date and a person. I thought of the photograph in the college archives, the faint pencil circles drawn around certain faces. What if the lines were not merely verse, but cipher? Poetry has always been the art of concealment, after all. A truth wrapped in rhythm. I fetched the photograph, still in its envelope, and laid it beside the quatrain. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the pattern declared itself. Each altered word in the poem corresponded to something within the photograph. A month that matched the date scrawled on the back. A name echoing one of the fellows. A reference to a window, which in turn recalled the background of the picture. It was not Hardy misremembered, but Hardy rewritten, recast to carry hidden bearings. I drew a pencil through the relevant faces. Eleanor Chase circled faintly. Markham, his expression stern. Forley, younger then, smiling awkwardly at the edge. The quatrain, decoded, was a map pointing back to these very figures. Whoever sent it was not inventing suspicion, but guiding it, like a hand steering mine across the page. The question that gnawed was simple. Who wanted me to look closer, and why cloak their urging in verse? Cowardice, perhaps, or an odd sense of theatre. Oxford encourages both. Anonymous letters are the college currency, as familiar as the toll of chapel bells. Yet the careful mimicry of Hardy, the precision of alteration, suggested not prankishness, but scholarship. Someone well-read, someone who trusted that I would notice. I let the thought settle. Outside, the rain began again, tapping at the glass in a rhythmic counterpoint to the words still echoing in my mind. I poured another measure, knowing sleep would not come easily. In the quiet that followed, I found myself oddly comforted. For weeks I had been chasing fragments, each dissolving the moment I reached for it. Now, at least, someone else was acknowledging the puzzle, feeding me a clue. Whether their purpose was to help or mislead remained uncertain, but it confirmed what I had half suspected since that first newspaper notice. Edmund Fawley's death was not a matter of natural causes, not a heart that failed of its own accord. The poem remained on my desk as the night surrendered to the greying light of morning. I copied it carefully into my notebook beneath Eleanor's curious remark about dreams. 2 fragments now, side by side, waiting to speak to each other. It was Lewis who first brought it, his face a mixture of triumph and perplexity, as though he had stumbled upon treasure only to find it counterfeit. The will of Edmund Fawley, redrafted scarcely 3 months before his death, pulled from a solicitor's office on the High Street. I read it slowly, with the cautious reverence one affords documents whose ink has not yet quite dried. The estate itself was modest. A pension, a few savings, a small collection of books, his papers. Enough to sustain a quiet retirement, though hardly more. What startled was not its size, but its direction. None of it was to pass to distant family in Devon, nor to the college that had tolerated his presence for 3 decades. Instead, it was bequeathed to a single entity, identified only as benefactor. No name, no description, no charity. Merely the word, bald and unexplained. Lewis said, almost apologetically, that the college had assumed itself the natural heir, as is customary with bachelors of Fawley's kind. The bursar had already begun to calculate what the endowment might yield, only to be told that the money was spoken for elsewhere. Rumors quickened, as they always do, attaching themselves to the most plausible target. That target was Professor Markham. Markham's reputation was a study in contradiction. A senior fellow, long established, yet dogged by whispers of reckless spending, poor investments, debts deferred with the ingenuity of desperation. There were murmurs of loans taken under false optimism, of wine merchants and bookmakers awaiting payment. Nothing proven, of course. Men of his stature are rarely brought to public account. But the suspicion was there, coiled and waiting. Lewis relayed what he had heard in the porter's lodge, that Markham and Fawley had been seen together in the senior common room late at night, their conversations hushed, that Markham, for all his severity, had grown oddly deferential towards Fawley in recent months. A don in need, a colleague with resources, a will revised. The story wrote itself. We asked to see him. His rooms were predictably austere. Oak paneling, the scent of old leather, curtains heavy with dust. Markham received us with a stiffness that might have been hauteur or fear. It is often difficult to tell the two apart. He listened while I mentioned the will, the anonymous benefactor, the estate left in limbo. He did not flinch, nor even pretend surprise. He said that he had no knowledge of it, that he and Fawley had exchanged pleasantries, but never confidences. Fawley was a man of solitary temper, he added, who seldom trusted anyone enough to write them into his affections. And then the phrase, "I cannot help you." It came once, then again, as if rehearsed. "I cannot help you." There was something about the rhythm that caught at me. Too precise, too ready on his tongue. Most men, when accused even obliquely, protest, explain, embroider. They do not retreat into repetition, like actors clinging to a line. Twice he said it, with a spacing between the words that suggested long practice. Lewis, earnest as ever, pressed him. Debts, surely. Friends had spoken of it. Markham smiled thinly, conceded difficulties. The stock market had not been kind, nor the horses, nor the wine merchants, but he insisted, with a touch of weary pride, that he would never demean himself by begging from Fawley. He gestured to his shelves, to the heavy tomes of Greek tragedy. He said that a man must endure his ruin as nobly as Oedipus endured his fate. Again the actor's cadences, rehearsed to the syllable. We left him in his rooms, his curtains unparted against the daylight. Lewis muttered, once we reached the quad, that the man was plainly guilty of something, if not of this, then of another thing close enough to touch. I agreed in part. Guilt clings to certain men like a fragrance, unmistakable yet indefinable. But the will, with its vague benefactor, remained opaque. If it was Markham's doing, why cloak it? Why not secure his name in print rather than hide behind anonymity? To inherit by disguise is a contradiction in terms. I carried with me the echo of his phrase, repeated as though it held within it both truth and concealment. I cannot help you. The more I turned it, the more it resembled not a denial, but a signal, as though he were reminding himself of the limits he dared not cross. That night, as I poured the last of a bottle into a cracked glass, I copied the phrase into my notebook, beneath the poem and the photograph. 3 fragments now, none whole, each resisting interpretation. But it is the fragments, not the certainties, that move us closer. Sleep remained elusive, a stranger lingering just beyond the door. I rose in the early hours, drawn not to whiskey or opera this time, but to that faded group portrait, the one Lewis had fetched from the archives. It lay where I had left it, half buried beneath case notes, the penciled circles faint as ghosts. The photograph had already unsettled me. Too neat, too composed, as though time had pressed it flatter than truth itself. Now, restless and raw, I returned to it. At first, nothing yielded. The faces were as I had studied them before. Young dons with their wary pride, Eleanor with her remote smile, Markham in his prime. Fawley sat squarely in the front row, his gaze detached, almost indulgent, the faintest smirk at some private amusement. I knew each feature by heart. Yet the longer I stared, the more a peculiar distortion revealed itself. It was not on the faces, but in the space between them. A smudge along the edge of Fawley's shoulder, the grain of the wall behind him unnaturally smooth, as if brushed by a clumsy hand. The light fell differently there, a flatness inconsistent with the rest of the print. I leaned closer, tracing it with a fingertip, and felt the certainty harden. The photograph had been altered. Someone had been removed. I fetched a magnifying glass from the drawer. Under its circle, the evidence grew clearer. A faint boot line out of alignment with the grass, an elbow cropped too sharply, the ghostly shadow of what once had been. Whoever had retouched it had done so with patience, but not mastery. A figure had stood beside Fawley, shoulder to shoulder, now erased, leaving only the emptiness of denial. The discovery startled me less than it should have. Perhaps because I had sensed it already, the wrongness humming at the edge of my mind. Still, the implications spread like cracks in stone. To alter a record of memory is to confess that the memory mattered. Someone had wished the absent man gone, not merely in life, but in history. At the Bodleian the next morning, I asked to see the matriculation registers for St. Athanasius in the early 70s. The librarian, amused at the eccentricities of police work, obliged with dusty volumes. I compared the faces from the photograph with the names inscribed in longhand. Slowly, the list narrowed until one absence aligned with a gap. A name, nearly forgotten, Julian Storr. Storr had entered the college in 1972, bright and promising. He studied history of art, like Forley. The archives recorded prizes won, essays admired, and then, abruptly, an ending. He had drowned in the Cherwell one May evening, the official account labeling it misadventure. A punt overturned, a body recovered too late. The notes were brief, as institutions prefer when scandal brushes too near. Yet something clung to the margins. A tutor's remark that Storr had shown intensity of attachment to certain fellows. A college meeting minuted with careful omissions. The phrase was clinical, but I had read enough to sense what was meant. Storr had been close to Forley, perhaps more than close, and when the river claimed him, the college buried not just the boy, but the memory. I thought again of the photograph, the deliberate excision. If Storr had stood at Forley's side, his erasure spoke of fear. Fear that recognition would stir old gossip, that shadows might creep into daylight. Yet someone had taken the trouble, years later, to alter the evidence. Not indifference, but intention. I returned to my rooms with the register notes in my pocket and set the photograph once more upon the desk. The absence now seemed louder than any presence, a silence imposed by artifice. I tried to picture the scene as it had been. Storr young, eager, leaning towards Forley. Forley half smiling, indulgent, complicit. And beside them, the others, caught between disapproval and concealment. Lewis, when told, frowned and asked the obvious. What did it prove? Only that Forley had once known a student who met a tragic end. College life was full of such episodes, rarely innocent, but usually forgotten. Why should this drowning matter now? I had no simple answer. Yet I knew that the erased man was the key. Storr's ghost threaded through the will, the poem, the whispers. I felt it with the same certainty as one feels the movement of air before a storm. The picture had changed, and with it the shape of the puzzle. That night I placed the photograph upright against the lamp, so the light fell upon the smoothed space where Storr had been. It glowed faintly, like a wound disguised, and I could not turn away. It was late afternoon when I asked them both to meet me in the master's drawing room, the only chamber in St. Athanasius that seemed willing to admit the autumn light without suspicion. Eleanor arrived first, her expression composed, though I thought I detected some fatigue about the eyes, a quietness in the way she set her gloves upon the arm of the chair. Markham followed moments later, a step heavy with reluctance, the mask of irritation only thinly applied. I dispensed with the courtesies. There was no longer room for them. I spoke instead of the photograph, of the missing figure airbrushed from the past. Julian Storr, I said, had once stood beside Edmund Forley. Their closeness had been no mere collegial bond. The college had suppressed the truth, buried the boy's drowning beneath euphemism, but the silence had never quite sufficed. Eleanor did not deny it. She inclined her head, the gesture solemn, as though she had rehearsed this moment in her mind. Edmund was reckless, she said at last, too fond of intensity, too careless of consequence. But he was also generous, brilliant, and alone. I could not betray him. I understood then the peculiar loyalty she had borne, not complicity in a crime, but the sorrowful instinct to shield a man already punished enough by history. Markham shifted in his seat, restless. He muttered that the past was the past, that nothing of it could alter the present reality of Forley's death. But I pressed on. The will naming an unnamed benefactor, the anonymous quatrain guiding me to the truth, the slip of phrase repeated in Markham's mouth as though memorized from a script. All of it formed a chain, links tightening about him. I told him plainly, Edmund Forley did not die of a heart attack. He died of digitalis, administered by a hand that sought to mimic the natural failures of the body. The doctor had been deceived, the master content to believe in chance, but the trace was there. faint yet indelible. For a moment he met my gaze with defiance, as though daring me to produce the vial, the packet, the witness. But guilt is a clumsy actor. His shoulders sagged, and the words came not in protest but in confession. He envied Fawley, he said. Envied his learning, his effortless charm, his ability to inspire devotion. Markham had struggled for recognition, labored under debts both financial and intellectual. Fawley's estate, modest though it was, represented security he could never quite reach. When he discovered the old scandal, the erased student, he saw at once the leverage it offered. He confronted Fawley, demanded his silence be bought. But Fawley had refused him, perhaps with that same amused detachment I had seen in the photograph. Edmund could never bear the thought of yielding to threat. Pride, or something darker, guided him. And in that refusal, Markham saw the ruin of his own position, debts exposed, career diminished, the long years of rivalry ending in humiliation. So he chose another course. He spoke of it haltingly, as though surprised by the sound of his own admission. He had studied Fawley's ailments, knew of his weak heart, knew too that digitalis in the proper measure would hasten what nature had already begun. He had prepared the dose, presented it as medicine, and watched as Fawley swallowed trustingly. The end had come swiftly, convincingly, and the college, eager for quiet, had accepted the fiction. Eleanor closed her eyes then, not in shock, but in weary recognition. She had suspected, I think, though her loyalty forbade her to articulate it. She whispered that Edmund had deserved pity, not envy, that he had lived haunted by a boy's drowning and by his own failure to save him. Her words hung in the air, heavy with that melancholy truth, that the past exacts its toll not only on its victims, but on those who linger too long within it. I did not answer. There was nothing to add. The explanation, long and meandering, had brought us here, to a room of dust and fading light, where one life lay concluded and another broken under its own confession. I left them to their silence, the sound of the college bell beginning its measured toll across the quadrangle. Later, walking back through the damp streets, I thought not of triumph, but of futility. A case resolved, yes, but with no satisfaction, only the ache of knowledge. Two men undone by love and envy, a woman bound by loyalty, a student erased first by the river, then by history, and finally by the cruel retouching of a photograph. The truth, when spoken, seldom sets anyone free. The case was finished, or so the paperwork would claim. The dons of St. Athanasius drew their shutters tight, whispering to one another in corridors that would outlast them all, guarding reputation with the same diligence as they had once guarded their Latin manuscripts. Scandal is survivable only when rendered inaudible. By the following term, Fawley's name would be spoken lightly, if at all, and Markham's absence explained by a polite euphemism. The college had already begun its erasure. Lewis had gone home. He had asked, with an awkward gentleness, whether I might prefer company for a pint, but I had waved him off. He was a good man, too good perhaps, for the air of Oxford, and he deserved a hearth more welcoming than mine. I told him I had reports to write. That was a lie, though not a malicious one. I walked instead, slow steps on the rain-darkened pavement, each corner of the city presenting itself as if painted anew by dusk. Oxford, after a case, has its own fragrance, stone releasing the day's dampness, bicycles rattling homeward, the faint musk of extinguished candles from chapel. The city lives on, indifferent to revelations of envy and betrayal. At the Randolph, I found my customary place, a table by the window where the reflections of the lamps seem always just a little older than the light itself. The barman knew not to speak more than necessary. I ordered the whiskey, and it came amber and untroubled, the kind of drink that seemed to pity rather than console. I thought then of Eleanor. She had thanked me earlier in the master's garden, her voice low, neither hostile nor inviting, but warm in a way that admitted no entry. She had said that the truth, though harsh, had spared the college a still deeper shame. Then she had looked at me with a gaze that suggested she was weighing words she would never allow herself to speak. "We all dream our lives differently each time we sleep," she had once told me, and I knew she meant it not as comfort, but as the outline of her own philosophy. To alter the dream was not to escape it. I repeated that sentence now beneath my breath, as one might repeat a clue whose meaning hovers just beyond recognition. We all dream our lives differently each time we sleep. She dreamed with dignity, with discipline. I, in contrast, dreamed in fragments, the wrong answers scrawled in a crossword margin, a snatch of opera cut short before the final aria, a hand reaching but not quite touching another. The whiskey did its work, softening the edges of recollection, though never erasing them. I thought of Forley, pride stitched together with longing, undone by a refusal to yield. I thought of Julian Storr, the boy lost to the river, his absence haunting a photograph for decades until someone had taken the trouble to efface him altogether. And I thought of Markham, whose confession had been less a cry than a weary collapse, as if envy itself had finally grown too heavy to carry. Oxford, outside the window, had already begun its drift into silence. The buses dwindled, the pavements glistened with a film of mist, and the towers, familiar yet aloof, held their shapes against the starless night. I felt, not for the first time, the peculiar ache of solitude, a pain sharper in victory than in failure. The case had been solved, but solutions are thin company. I finished the whiskey, ordered another, and listened to the quiet hum of the bar. A couple spoke softly at the far end, their laughter carefully muffled. A visiting American asked about dining hours and received a polite reply. No one looked at me. That, I decided, was a mercy. In the end, I thought, the city had its own rhythm of concealment. The dons hid behind their gates, the colleges behind their centuries, the citizens behind their routines, and I, behind the glass of the Randolph, hid too, though with less conviction. The bell of St. Mary's tolled the hour, in the sound carried across the rooftops like a reminder that time is the only detective whose cases are always closed. I lingered over the last mouthful, reluctant to let it go, as though the glass itself were a tether to something warmer. Then I set it down, empty, and allowed the silence to take its place. Evening fell with the same hesitant grace as an overture whose conductor cannot quite decide the tempo. Oxford had shed its daylight like an old coat, leaving behind a texture of shadow and half-light, each street corner holding its own private rehearsal of silence. I walked without purpose. The case concluded, my pockets filled only with the stubborn company of thought. The streets were slick from an earlier shower. Lamplights scattered across the cobblestones, pools of amber trembling with each passing bicycle. I allowed myself the small luxury of slowness, for once not pursuing, not being pursued, merely existing in that in-between hour when the city draws curtains but keeps windows ajar. Somewhere, I knew lectures were being written, essays corrected, arguments rehearsed in the senior common rooms where claret and grudges were served in equal measure. Yet outside those gates, the city breathed differently, weary, faintly forgiving. I passed the Sheldonian, its windows dark, and caught the faint echo of a violinist practicing alone in one of the rehearsal rooms. A single phrase repeated, faltering, returning again, like someone trying to persuade themselves of something their heart already knew to be true. I stopped a moment to listen, then moved on. Memory, when it chooses, falls with the same insistence as rain. I thought of Forley, of how carefully he had built his world of scholarship, fragile as porcelain, and how quickly it had cracked beneath the weight of envy and concealment. I thought of Markham, broken by his own hunger, and of the drowned boy, Julian, whose absence had been painted over, yet whose outline had never truly vanished. And Eleanor, above all, Eleanor, whose eyes seemed at once to invite and repel, whose words, precise as a scalpel, still lingered within me. We all dream our lives differently each time we sleep. I'd written it in my notebook, but the line had already engraved itself in my mind. I turned down Broad Street, then into a smaller lane where a cafe still kept its lamps lit. Students, laughing too loudly, passed me in a group, the night theirs in a way it could never be mine again. I paused at the window. 2 cups rested upon a small table. The chairs remained pulled out, as though expecting occupants who had momentarily stepped away. The steam had long since thinned into nothing. No one came. The scene was ordinary, undistinguished. Yet it pierced. I stood watching longer than I should have, imagining the conversation that had not happened, the warmth of hands curved around porcelain, the possibility of company, denied by circumstance or choice. In another life, perhaps, the second cup might have been mine, or hers, or anyone's. But not tonight. Not in this life. The ache was faint, but it was there, insistent as a cough that cannot be suppressed. I felt its shape within me, familiar and unrelenting. I turned away, unwilling to grant the moment more power than it already possessed, and continued down the street. My shoes made a steady rhythm against the stone, the kind of rhythm that insists one must keep walking. The bells began to toll again, somewhere behind me. Not urgent, not sorrowful, simply there. Oxford was always tolling, as if to remind its inhabitants that every hour belonged not to them but to time itself. I reached the river. The water carried the day's fragments away. Stray leaves, a film of oil from some careless boatman, the faint shimmer of reflected lamps. I leaned on the railing, lit a cigarette, and watched the smoke mingle with the night air until both became indistinguishable. I'd solved the case, yes. The explanation was neat enough for the files, though never neat in the heart. No victory, no triumph. Only the knowledge that the truth, however painful, had been placed in its rightful drawer while the lives it touched continued with their private wounds. Eleanor would walk her cloisters, teaching her students lines from Donne, her voice calm, her solitude chosen or endured. I could not tell which. Lewis would return to his family, his laughter loud in rooms where mine would never echo, and I, once more, to the quiet of my rooms, my whiskey, my crosswords left unfinished. I dropped the cigarette end into the river, watched it flare briefly, then die. A wind stirred. The night moved on. There were 2 cups. She lived alone,